maybe a painful, sad, tragic, horrible story, if you think that we're just watching a child be tortured and killed needlessly, and that it's just one bad thing after another until he's dead. And then if the other response to the ending seems to be that he is saved at the end, that there's the classic moment of grace accepted at the end of this O'Connor story, in spite of all the bad things that are going on for this little kid, have gone on and are going on in the course of the story, and that somehow he triumphs over all of it. And it's a great, happy death. At one conference, I think it might have been 2008 or 2010, I had two speakers in the opening session, and one person got up and said, I'm a Baptist, and and therefore this story drives me crazy. I mean, this really bothers me. It's a terrible thing. All of the adults are terrible, and it's horrible to watch what happens to little Harry Bevel. And the story is an attack on everybody, and it's awful, awful, awful. And followed that up with a talk by a priest who said, and was willing to, bring in the theology to say, this is a story with a happy ending, and the kid's life is bad in a lot of ways, but he's saved at the end of the story, and so it's really a happy story. And you couldn't be further apart on what to make of this story than those two folks were. And as a person who's scheduling sessions, I was just applauding myself and saying, oh, isn't that clever that we have such a difference of opinion about a story to get things started. We're not all going to agree with each other all the time. And I think The River is a story that causes really strong reactions that some people are confused by, but most people read it and they're pretty sure that they know what's going on here and they have strong feelings about it. And then they're really surprised when they find somebody else had equally strong opinions that are very different. One of the reactions that is most memorable to me comes from the 2007 NEH Institute. Jackie, you may remember this experience, that Barbara Bogue, who was part of that institute, when we were showing the film version of the River. It's a half-hour film, low budget, but worth seeing. We showed the film version of it one night in the Arts and Sciences Auditorium. I happened to be sitting on the same row that Barbara was sitting on, and she had such a reaction, such a negative reaction to what was in the film, that she jumped up and was going to exit the hall. And I was too slow to get out of her way when she started bolting for the door, and she kind of tripped over me on her way out. I think that the experience of reading the story and then seeing the film really haunted her. I do think she made it to the ending. I think one of the things that she objected to, and you can think about whether you think this is an appropriate thing for a filmmaker to do, at the end of the film version of The River, as the little boy is drowning, you hear him laughing, like as if he's having a great time, that he's getting something he really wanted, like he's got what he hoped for from this experience. Well, I don't think Barbara went for that part. She ended up writing a long essay, which I eventually published, uh, in which, I mean, the short version is she said, this is all very close to home. My mother was an alcoholic, and I went through a lot of things like what Harry Bevel went through with his mother. And it was all bad. I mean, there was a lot of pain involved. And watching the movie, reading the story, brought it all back. She ended up writing an essay in which she was talking about the story, and she was talking about her mother, and she was talking about Flannery and her mother, and she was having conversations between her mother and Flannery O'Connor's mother. I mean, it was really getting really complicated. And I thought, this is great. It's driving Barbara crazy to think about this story, but I loved watching it. And I think Barbara recovered from the, from the experience. The story made her hurt all over, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think, well, this is the classic response to reading a Flannery O'Connor story. This is what it's going to do to you sometimes. And fine. I mean, I don't know that I said that at the time. I think I said, I'm so sorry this troubles you so, Barbara, but there you are. Another example of a strong response to this story is Truman Capote's. If you've ever seen the movie Capote about the writing of In Cold Blood, you get to the end of the movie and there are those lines on the screen that tell you what happened to all of the characters later. I mean, and it says he never wrote another book, that writing In Cold Blood and compromising himself morally by writing In Cold Blood, just kind of killed his career, and he never wrote anything else, which isn't true. He did write more stuff. Wasn't as good as In Cold Blood, but then, you can say that about everybody, that after they wrote their best book, they wrote things that weren't as good. He wrote a novella and put it into a later book called Music for Chameleons. I can't say I recommend this music of this book particularly. I don't think it's great fiction, but it is fascinating for somebody with an interest in O'Connor, because he puts a character who's kind of obviously Flannery O'Connor into this novella. It's called Hand-Carved Coffins, and it is a kind of over-the-top murder mystery. And Truman Capote makes himself into a character who is kind of a detective type, trying to figure out who's doing these bizarre murders. And at a certain point in this little novella, he remembers his baptism and how a minister baptized him in a river and nearly drowned him, intentionally or not. And I thought, well, there aren't a whole lot of details here that say he's using the river, but once he puts Flannery O'Connor into his novella as a story, I think he's reacting to the river. Now, did that push a button? Did he go through something in his childhood that Flannery's story brought back, and made him relive painfully? Well, maybe. And well, that's the power of this story. It may be painful, but it always gets a reaction. Sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. I think probably some people stop reading O'Connor once they read The River and say, this is more than I want to have to take. What next? I guess that's the end of that thought, that you could have a very positive notion about the ending. You can have a very negative notion about the ending. Well, and it may be that the issue is, can you feel good about what happens to the end? Because do you think that a religious breakthrough is happening for this little kid at the end of the story? And for some people, the crucial piece of information is how old he is. And for some people, the crucial information is, has he reached the age of reason as the church defines it? Is he older than his age as reported in the story? So is he somehow an adult in the form of a child? Why does Flannery O'Connor have her narrator say that he was 4 or 5? Seems like if you're writing the story, you should know. That's a little oddity that I imagine some people have strong opinions about. You can read this as a story that is painful, sad, because Harry misunderstands one thing and then another thing and then another thing and then another thing until he gets himself killed or commits suicide. Or, and part of that negative reading is that you might be watching a series of adults not do all that they should do for him. So you're watching him be neglected by a whole cast of adult characters, and that might make the story really painful. Or if you want to put a happier spin on it, you can go through the entire story and say, Harry is creating his own 4-year-old mythology in the course of the story, and he gets what he wants, gets what he needs out of it, and it may be based on the life of Jesus Christ for readers under 12, and he could have Flannery rooting for him and saying, good for you, kid. He is quite independent in his way. At the end of the story, he gets up and he says he's leaving home and there's nothing he wants to take with him. He passes by Mrs. Connon's house and doesn't check to see whether anybody happens to be home that day. He even says he doesn't need the preacher anymore. He's going to take total charge and baptize himself. I believe he actually uses those words. Do you believe that's possible? It's a strain to make that orthodox. It's a strain to make that follow the rules of a church. But there are plenty of people who have written about this story and seen Harry as getting Flannery's approval as a kid who figures out the world in the course of this story for himself and becomes really independent and in a good way. And there again, this can be really irritating or attractive about the story. I see some comments passing by. I'm not reading all the chat comments, but I will say, yes, it's kind of like what you might make of The Lame Shall Enter First, a kind of comparable story from quite a few years later in O'Connor's career, in which a little boy decides that if he hangs himself, he will be with his mama and maybe in heaven. And that is a really painful story if you think that little kid has been misled by all the other manipulative older folks in the story. And it's a little easier to take if you think that at least the little boy gets what he wants at the end of the story. Now, I'll admit that I'm working on an essay about, in which the river figures. Uh-oh, says everybody. The essay is about a medieval tradition of boy bishops, that you pull a kid, usually from the choir, around Christmas time. This is centuries ago. And you declare that for a short period around the holidays, this child has religious authority. And yes, I can document situations in which children pulled from the choir were given the right to administer sacraments. That they're, it's turning the world topsy-turvy. Okay, it's holiday time, so you get to play bishop. Oh yeah, there's a character in Flannery O'Connor who happens to be named Bishop. I would make all the same claims about Bishop in The Violent Buried Away. I would make all the same claims about Lucette Carmody in The Violent Buried Away. But I kind of think that Harry Bevel is, that type of character who's starting from scratch and, being misled about a bunch of things in a way, takes on a kind of religious authority. Did Flannery O'Connor know about the medieval tradition? Well, we can't prove it, but I kind of rest on the assumption all the time that Flannery O'Connor knew everything about what was going on in the church. And she would use it if it made a story better. And it's not up to her to prove to us that that was what she was intending. If it's in the story, it's in the story. So that's another way that I can read this story and not be totally depressed by it. Okay. Now, what else is an issue? You say, how long have I bibbled on about this story? And all I'm talking about is Harry Bevel. Let's talk about some of the adults. The first 20 times I read the story, I think I assumed that Mrs. Connon and the Reverend Bevel Summers were the heroes of the story. And in subsequent readings, in my old age and my cynicism, I guess, I have gotten more skeptical about both of them. And why do I bring this up? Because I think it makes the story better if I can ask questions about all of the adults, not just the parents. If I can ask questions about all of the stories as maybe not perfect human beings. And I'll elaborate a little bit. Okay, what's the knock on Mrs. Connon? And I can say some nice things about Mrs. Connon, okay? She's nice to the little boy. Criticism is always very nice to Mrs. Connon. Okay, well, what can you say against Mrs. Connon? She takes on the job of taking over this child for, what is it, about 16 hours one day after she's gotten off her all-night shift. But she doesn't know his name. I would say, well, this might not be ideal preparation for doing this job. She's really stretching herself beyond her ability to do a good job, perhaps. She takes Harry home, she feeds him, she talks to him, she gives him the book that she realizes he needs. But when that happens, we also meet her kids. How are we supposed to respond to Mrs. Connon's children? When I compare Harry Bevel, who hasn't had the greatest childhood apparently, to the children of Mrs. Connon, who kind of seems to be presented in the story as a good guy, I'm inclined to say, well, it doesn't seem to have done much for their character, but Mrs. Connon has been their mama I mean, the first thing they do is they meet this little boy and they say, oh, what can we do to torture him? What trick can we play on him? What can we do to be mean? Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of chat, I see.
Well, actually, I'm not looking at the chat so much. This is actually from my question.
Oh, yeah.
Why are pigs always so evil?
They're not, well, here
they're
they might
evil,
be evil,
but they're scary.
Yeah, they're scary. They're scary because, well, in this story, they do attack. They are out to get little boys. They do look mean, and the negative vibe that you get from the pigs in this story is what I think it's in there to impress upon you that we're talking reality. That in contrast to a happy version of pigs with smiling faces and bow ties that he got from a children's book, apparently that his parents bought him, he sees the ugly, mean pigs in the Life of Jesus Christ for readers under 12, and it resembles the real pigs he just saw, and he decides, okay, this book is telling the truth. And I think, okay, that's what she wants. I was once forced by a dissertation director to write more about pigs, and I don't think in O'Connor, and I don't think I did a very good job of it. I just published an article in the Flannery O'Connor Review, which has been the mail to some people as we speak, in which he talks about the pigs in Revelation, the final story, and he makes the case that the final scene where everybody's going to heaven, that what we're supposed to see is pigs in space, like the Muppet Show, that all these people are pigs and they're all going to heaven, like they were shot out in a rocket ship. And I never thought of that, and he makes a really good case, and I think that's wonderful. And I think, well, in that story, the pigs are redeemed. Those are the most wonderful pigs you'll ever want to see in a short story. And so I would go back to this story and say, these pigs are just being pigs, and they're being used by humans to make them threatening. There's nothing inherently bad about these pigs. And I don't think Flannery is really into using animals to symbolize evil. That's how I feel today. And we could probably think of an example that's an exception to that. But I think, she's much more likely to look at human beings and say, okay, here's some evil for you folks. We just had our first thunder, which of course we had to have. Next month we're going to do the Life You Stay May Be Around, and we will have a turnip shaped cloud descend upon us at the end of our discussion.
Well, I noticed the thunder went as soon as you said Flannery's.
That's right. Yeah. So there's no telling what's going to happen next. What else? A whole nother topic. Okay, let's talk about something that I don't have a theory about yet. There's a distinction in this story between art for children and art for adults. Okay, there's the children's book that Harry Bevel owns that has smiling pigs with bow ties, and he figures out that that's a total lie. And it's a lie because it was prepared for children. This is what we ought to feed the children, this kind of lie. Is that fair? And then we've got what's, I think, labeled as clearly adult art that no child would have any appreciation for. The primary examples being the jazz music that the Ashfield parents listen to and the modern art that is on their wall. And Mrs. Connon makes her snide remarks about I wouldn't have that around me. Classic anti-modern art comments.
Actually, I have a few
Yeah,
more
yeah,
questions.
Yeah.
One is about Mrs. Conant and the others are about pigs.
Okay. Shoot.
Yeah, dissertation director must have seen your future. Is it possible to think Mrs. Conant in regard to Harry Bevel as a first draft of Old Mason in regard to Francis?
Oh, yes. The connections between this story and the Violet Bear It Away and the Lame Shall Enter First, they're there in the manuscript record. Flannery was always writing everything all the time, and everything fed into everything else that she was gonna produce. And so they come out of the same blender. What she was working on with this story, she rethought for those other works. But if you think there's a connection, sure, it's complicated, but it's there. Yeah. And it might be a reason why you that you have your mind open to more complicated possibilities in the story, because you see that in later work she could return to a situation that's kind of like this and plays it out a different way. I would say this story is sweetness and light compared to the way I feel at the end of The Lame Shall Enter First. That story just seems like an exercise in torturing the reader. And it's great torture, but I find it very difficult to feel good at the end of that one. And of course, this inspires my students to write long papers, which they prove me wrong. Gosh, that's happened so many times over the years when I express my opinions about how I feel about that story.
Well, Jackie also said that pigs represent, there's much talk about pigs. So pigs also represents the Gadarines who cause madness in the man. He is released and they go over the cliff. The Gadarines reject Christianity and the pigs represent that. Maybe like the guests at the party who only see the book as something financially valuable. Mm-hmm. And then another pig question is from Cheryl. What can you conclude about Bevel thinking Mr. Paradise looked like a giant pig bounding after him when he dived in the water?
Well, right. At the end of the story, I think Harry is assuming that pigs are bad. He's being chased by a pig again. And, Mrs. Conant said, Mr. Paradise looks like a pig. I mean, it's said kind of bluntly early on in the story. So at the end of the story, Harry is being chased by a pig, and so he's not just moving towards the good thing he thinks is waiting for him under the river. He's also running away from a pig. I mean, I don't know that Harry is thinking, here comes a pedophile with his candy and he's going to molest me, which is a possibility, but I don't know that I think the kid could be aware of that. I think that stuff about pedophilia is just for the enjoyment of the reader. And so, but he's got reason that we can believe in to run away from Mr. Paradise as he's running toward something else at the end of the story. So, Flannery is saying, how am I going to make it believable that the kid does what he does? How do I make it believable that the kid would actually drown himself at the end? And, she piles on several possible explanations for what could be happening here. And I do run into people who read this story and say, he's committing suicide because his life is so terrible, terrible, terrible. And he really just wants it to be over. And I've never read it that way, but, I've seen, more than one person who came up with that response that's going on here. And well, there are lots of explanations. And the pig symbolism might have something to do with it. Let's see now. Well, we're talking about Mr. Paradise. As the decades go by, and I keep reviewing the story over and over and over and over, I wonder whether we're supposed to think that something changes at the end of the story for Mr. Paradise. when he goes chasing after Harry at the end of the story, is he chasing after the kid because he's saying, oh, now's my chance, I will go grab this kid and I won't even have to seduce him with the candy stick, I will just molest him? Or is he snapping out of it and saying, this isn't my prey, this kid's about to drown himself, I've got to save him? Maybe he is going through more of a change in the course of the story for the good than any of the other adults. Now, I can't claim that Flannery spells this out, that she fleshes that out. That last paragraph doesn't exactly say that, he's having a redemptive moment at the end of the story. But I have an easier time, personally, imagining something good happening to Mr. Paradise than to the other characters, the other adults.
I'm staying muted, but how does that fit into what Jackie Zubek says in that last comment?
Okay, what was the last comment, Jackie?
Mr. Paradise, when we opened her up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Say it again, Jackie.
Just a minute, Jackie.
Wait, she's not unmuted yet.
Yeah.
Can we? Yeah, Jackie. Oh, now she's muted again.
You okay? Ready?
There you are.
Hello. He shows up at these meetings to say, "Look, I'm not healed," and it's his ear, so he's not hearing it. And I like this idea, though, that he suddenly, and this obscene candy stick, it's pretty obvious, but maybe he does have that change of heart. His name is Paradise, so I don't know. Maybe there's something there.
Okay, and so. When I go through the story and I say, am I crazy in imagining something good for Mr. Paradise? I may be crazy, but if you really have no interest in religion, do you really go to the river for faith healing to heckle the preacher? Do you go to the river and put an unbaited hook in the river if you're not trying to fish for something? I mean, it seems to me you could say he's one of those junior high kids who expresses his fondness, his desire by being mean. Like somebody who likes somebody and so goes and hits her on the shoulder. That it seems to me he's a seeker all the way through the story. If you really don't care about religion, you can find something better to do with your time than go and heckle the Reverend Bevel Summers. And so I think, okay, he just wishes something would happen to him. And it's weird. I don't look at Mr. Paradise and think of him as a model for much of anything, but O'Connor seems to me always to be teaching me to try to be more open-minded, that I don't understand everything about what might be going on in somebody who looks pretty bad. Maybe there's more to the story than I see at first or than I appreciate, and I tend to put Mr. Paradise in that category. Now,
we just had a comment that
yeah.
Margaret wants to say something.
Sure. Hey, Margaret.
We unmute her.
We're unmuting you.
Or unmuting or whatever.
Well, we're taking turns muting and unmuting. We're trying to unmute Margaret. There you go.
Okay. I have a question about what is your theory as to why Harry took the name of the preacher? Why did he take on the preacher's name? And also, why do you think he stole the book from Mrs. Connor?
My answers are simple. I imagine somebody can come up with a really complicated answer to these. if I keep reminding myself, he might be just 4, I think. He wants Mrs. Connon to like him. He knows that she likes the Reverend Bevel. He wants to be the person she likes, or like the person she likes. And it's spontaneous, but that doesn't mean it's not from deep down in him. I mean, it's like a demand that she should love him. I am just like this person you just said you like. And I don't have to go much beyond that to justify that to myself. Why does he steal the book? Because in a lot of ways, he's kind of a stereotypical bad little boy who's been acting up, acts out all the way through the story, doing bad stuff because he's the cry for attention of a perfectly average sort. And he sees the book and he reads the book, and it obviously is of value to Mrs. Connon. And he just latches onto it and thinks that this is wonderful, this is mine. And of course, that's the easy part of why does he steal the book? I mean, where it gets, where it's totally mysterious is he puts it in, he hides it away in his coat, and I guess it doesn't get destroyed from being in the river, you know, so, and then it goes home and it's still in his possession, it's still in his coat at that point. And there's something spooky going on. There's something mysterious going, something mystical going on. I think Flannery is saying we are to believe that possession of the physical object is better than understanding. That I think Flannery is such an anti-intellectual, a very serious intellectual anti-intellectual, that I can read this story as an attack on smarts. You know, this kid who doesn't understand anything is going to do better than all of the adults who are, you know, who think they're using their brains all the way through the story. So I think when he, I mean, just run down the field as far as I can, I would say, when he puts the life of Jesus for readers under 12 into his coat and says, I'm stealing this, that's Flannery saying, okay, he's a Christian. This counts. Just the way the Reverend says, okay, now you count because I dunked you in the water. It's you know, kind of extreme, insistent, unorthodox theology we got going here, but I think it makes a good story, and Flannery would do anything to make a big story, a good story. The piece of this conversation, I'm not really changing the subject. The best thing Mrs. Connon does is give him that book. From that point on, it seems to me she's, I mean, she takes him to the river and she does what I think his mother is justifiably angry about, you know, having the kid baptized without parental consent. The really questionable thing on Mrs. Connon's part is that after she's done all these good things and gotten Harry's hopes up, she takes him home at the end of the day, which may be 16 hours, and dumps him, and it's clear she will never come back. Why wouldn't Harry take in that he's being abandoned again, betrayed again, as he has been abandoned so many times before, or I feel that way, you know, that nobody does right by me. I'm being mistreated again. I'm not getting long-term goodies from anybody. Doesn't he think Mrs. Connon is turning against him? That final conversation that she has with the parent, she's really upset that his name isn't Bevel. Well, you know, should she really be so mad at the kid for playing that little trick on her? And she shifts into being mad at the parents somehow when the parents didn't tell him to fake that his name was Bevel. If I go through that scene and I'm trying to look at it from the little boy's point of view, I think there's nothing about this to be happy about. And so I can look at the story and start picking at Mrs. Connon and having doubts about her as, you know, to what extent is she doing the right thing? I think in O'Connor's eyes, the good thing she does is to hand him the book. And if he didn't steal it, it's hard to imagine how he would feel like he could really hang on to it at all, because the person who gave it to him is going to disappear on him. And if he was suspicious, he was right about that. And a similar sort of thing can be said, not quite as powerfully, not quite as negatively, about the Reverend. Now, I read a book one time written by a seminary professor at a Methodist cemetery in Memphis. And he was talking about, where do you find model preachers in literature? And he had a section on O'Connor, and he said, Hazel Motes and the Reverend Bevel Summers are models for what Methodist ministers should be. Woo! And then he knows that people might be a little surprised that he would say that Hazel Motes is a model for us all, but you know, he turned that into any preacher ought to have convictions as strong as the convictions of Hazel Motes. Well, maybe. He was more confident when he said that the Reverend Bevel Summers was wonderful, was perfect in every way, and everybody should act the way, you know, every preacher should act the way the Reverend Bevel Summers acts. People have gone through, you know, all the parts of the story that, there you go, have gone through the story and made the case that the Reverend never says anything wrong. You know, that everything that he says to the people by the river for the healing is the right thing to say. And that he is a good guy theologically. My quibble with the Reverend is that I don't believe that Harry could possibly follow the complicated stuff that the Reverend is saying by the river. I mean, I've heard this from a bunch of different situations, that if you put the word not in a sentence, about 75% of the people who hear you say that sentence are going to hear everything except the word not. They're going to hear the exact opposite of what you intended to say. And so we should all rewrite everything we ever say. So we never say the word not, we never say the word never. So when the Reverend says, you can't go into this river and find God, well, that just goes across to a child, especially, as you can go in this river and you'll find God. And so I think the Reverend would say, well, poor kid, he got the exact wrong idea out of what I was telling him. He just wasn't paying attention closely enough. And I think, well, you know, you did take on the responsibility of baptizing this child. Don't you think you should have paid a little more attention to what this kid thinks just happened to him? You know, maybe you should have a little chat with him before he goes home. And so the quibble to have with the Reverend is, I guess, maybe just that he starts down the wrong path, and then he says things that are going to be misinterpreted, and maybe that's maybe that turns out bad. Of course, you have to read the story as having a terrible ending to give the Reverend a hard time about this.
Alex Joyner has an interesting point in the chat that he says is actually, Alex, I unmuted you if you want to say.
Yeah.
Well, I am a Methodist minister, so when you say that, I think the thing I appreciate about those two ministers is the fact that they are not seeking to make it easy for the people. I mean, they emphasize how difficult it is. You're not going into this river to get rid of your pain. This is, so it's, I appreciate the kind of truth that they're shining a light on. And there's something to me in the current of the river, because there's a lot of emphasis on up and down. You get immersed in the water, you come up. He goes in and he talks about the boy goes in and feels like he's fighting against some force, but it's only when he releases and lets the current take him away that he seems to discover. To me, it's an ambiguous ending, but to me, it's not a tragic ending. It's a release into whatever the stream is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Are you unmuting?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So Mary, I'm going to unmute you too, if you don't mind. Let me see if I can get that to her. There we go.
That's
Mary, you want to talk a little bit about your comment?
I don't know. I do better with typing than I do with talking.
Do you want me just to read it out loud so we can talk about it a little bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm fine with, yeah, if you want me to read it out loud, I will. I said, I was just looking at the story and it stood out to me where he lived, everything was a joke.
Yeah.
And so he was used to people joking and he never knew when to take his family seriously.
Yeah.
And Jesus was basically a joke, or it was, something, he had a very negative understanding of who Jesus was from his parenting. And then, just so you know, I'm Catholic, so it also, I thought about the significance that a Catholic, especially with confirmation, but baptism too, you take the name of a saint at baptism. So whether he knew that or not, the symbolism of that, taking a different name, and I was really fascinated what you said about the medieval bishop, the child bishop.
Boy bishops. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also pointed out that bevel rhymes with devil. So the whole question of that and her love of playing on words and the meaning of the names. And I think Flannery is always doing this. I am, I'm not a English professor or anything, but her love of realism, to take things exactly as they are with no, exaggeration. It is what it is. And so he liked the book basically because he could see that it's realistic.
Mm-hmm.
They're not taking the Bible, she talks about that in The Nature and Aim of Fiction, the biblical exegesis applied to literature. So he realized people that talk about Jesus, these people are taking him seriously. And so the book seemed serious.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas all he had ever heard from his family was, again, Jesus, he didn't even really know who Jesus was. He seemed like a joke. And then I said him stealing the book like that was really like the violent bear it away is what I thought of, because also it's interesting that age of reason question, because, you can say that the Holy Spirit's working on the kid because he's really kind of like tied up in this moment of truth, his apocalypse or what have you. Sorry.
You're fine. You're bringing up a bunch of different things. My reaction is, we haven't talked about name symbolism. Why is he called Harry by the author, and why does he choose the name Bevel? I mean, for some people, all the meanings that you might attach to Bevel have to matter in the story. He goes from a very common name, like he's a Tom, Dick, or Harry, to a peculiar name that you may never have heard of being attached to a human being, and a bevel is a kind of, odd angle? Does that explain everything? Is it like choosing a saint's name because in his innocent way, he thinks, oh, this is somebody good, I would like to take that name. Is that supposed to be Flannery saying, see, he's going through a traditional religious pattern or creating it for himself, but it's similar enough for us to take it, that way. What do you do with the name Mr. Paradise? What do you do with the name Ashfield? Gosh, that's kind of negative, isn't it? What do you do with the name Conan? Does that suggest wisdom or that she's a con? You can make that positive or negative. Why is the name Summers? My impression of the word Summers is that it has to be it has to carry positive connotations. I guess I kind of imagine that this story is taking place in the summer. It seems like part of what is leading you to be open to the possibility that Flannery likes this 19-year-old Protestant preacher. And I will say nice things about the Reverend Bevel in the classroom whenever students start saying that Flannery O'Connor writes to make fun of Protestants. Because I want to keep everybody off balance, of course. Whenever she names a character John Wesley, there's probably a little dig in there someplace. And but I've never taken those little anti-Methodist comments as terribly seriously. I think she's pretty ecumenical. I mean, look at what she says about old Tarwater and the Violet Buried Away. He's as independently Protestant as you can be, and then she praises him by saying he's discovering all of the truths of Catholicism in his bizarro way, and she's behind him 100% or something like that. I don't think she's terribly devoted to proving through her fiction that Catholicism is infinitely superior to other religious outlooks. That truth was so obvious to her that she didn't have to spend her time on it in what she wrote. She could be generous towards other outlooks, I think, in her fiction, and be okay with that. Oh goodness, we are just about out of time. What else did we not get to? To me, the key line of the whole story, I forgot to mention this lately, the key line of the whole story is the moment when Harry comes back at the end of his day and his mama asks him, what happened to you today? And he says, I don't know, like any kid who doesn't want to talk about it would say. And then his mother says, I think totally believably, this is what any mother would say, yes, you do know. You do understand what happened to you today. Well, if Harry does understand what happened to him today, that makes all the difference on how you're going to take the rest of the story. If it's up to me to fill the last 3 minutes, I will say.
Just a minute.
Yeah,
we have
sure.
one more comment from George.
George.
On the names.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that O'Connor is always fiddling around with names in these stories. But it strikes me that there might be something paradoxical or ironic about the names Paradise and Bevel.
Sure.
That the sort of ostensibly evil character in the story is named Paradise, and the name of that beautiful 19-year-old preacher is Bevel. I mean, because of course somebody's already mentioned this, but Bevel sort of suggests the angle, right? You know, I'm sure all of you know in As I Lay Dying, Faulkner makes a lot about uh, uh, um, the one son that's building the coffin.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to cut the corners on the bevel.
Out of Bevel, right? And
Cat
that's one novel we
Cash.
know she read and liked.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
Cash, you know, so that the preacher is a guy with an angle.
Yeah.
And so there's something where so the bad guy is named Paradise and the preacher is named.
I would say, as a generalization, that Flannery always gives you names that carry obvious significance, but then the longer you think about them, the more paradoxical and complicated they look, so that she hooks you by making you think you got it, and then you can always find another way to be confused about it again afterwards, so you'll have to come back and read the story again. Let me end, because I see it's 5:29. Let me end with a comment about the complicated paradoxicality of the ending. A hand reaches out to Harry Bevel and pulls him into the water at the end. Who does he think that is? Does he think it's Jesus? Does he think it's Mama? Does he think it's Daddy? Does he think it's Mr. Paradise? Can you think of any other possibilities? Is this Harry getting what he wants at the end of the story? I don't know if I mentioned it. At the end of the film version, they have Harry laughing as he's drowning. They kind of insist that find a happy ending here, figure out why this kid's so happy at the end of the story as he's going under for the last time. Or are we supposed to think that this is a situation in which he thinks he's getting what he wants, but whoever he thinks is grabbing him at the end, he's going to have another moment after the final page when he's drowning and this is going to turn bad. You know, I guess it depends on whether you think drowning is a great way to go, or whether you know, you think it's going to turn horrific again at the end of the story. It's what makes it a richly ambiguous story. Oh, here's one last kicker. In A Good Man is Hard to Find in Other Stories, Flannery puts A Good Man is Hard to Find first. And she said to people that the death of children in A Good Man is Hard to Find is of total insignificance. I think she even said somewhere, God does not care about the death of John Wesley and June Starr and the baby, because she wanted everybody to pay attention to what was going on between the misfit and the grandmother. And then she puts next to that story, the river. As soon as you've been beaten up by A Good Man is Hard to Find, you're going to have this other story in which the only thing that matters in the whole world is what's happening to this poor little kid. You know, she didn't write the same story over and over and over in some ways. You know, she writes a story that is like the opposite in a way to what she just made you read. And it seems to me there's something really good in terms of, you know, being a fiction writer and what she's pulling off just by juxtaposing, you know, these two stories and the way she arranges her collection. I'm going to turn on the chat and read all the comments, which I try to ignore while we're in the middle of a conversation, because I'll get even more, you know, scatterbrained than I am. If anybody wants to email me and carry on the conversation, feel free. bruce.gentry@gcsu.edu. And we'll see you next time. Irene, you want to make an announcement or something?
Well, it's just about ready to thunderstorm here.
The turnip cloud is right there.
So Flannery is letting us know it's time to be over. So.
Yes, get out. Run for it now. Okay. Bye. Bye, everybody.
It's good seeing you
Thank
all.
you
Take
all.
care.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Okay, I want to click on chat. I can still make this all appear, can't I? Yeah, here we go. Ooh, Ixodrill. Ooh, okay, Norse mythology. Yeah, okay. Somebody needs to do a whole thing on Norse mythology and O'Connor. I don't think that's been done yet. I'm just scrolling through comments now.
Do you know what our books, are there any Norse mythology?
I don't recall. I just think she did review books that were about other theologies. And so I wouldn't be surprised if she knew enough.
Right.
The whole thing between the grandmother and the misfit as a bird and a snake, that confrontation and the way it's described at the end of the story, I've always suspected that if I did a lot of reading about Norse mythology, I'd find out that that's where it comes from and that it has something to do with Ixodrill, or however you say that, the sacred tree. But I'm not the one to do that that research. Somebody else can do that one, boy, that's for sure. Okay, I'm having a hard time moving up. Here we go. Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. It's getting cool.
I know. It's finally good.
I should be horrified. Okay. Sure. Well, if y'all are all reading the chat comments, I think, there's nothing here that's not worth reading. All reasonable things to say about this story, which is more complicated than it looks. Let's say that. That this is a story that people at first read and they say, oh, that was simple. That's not as complicated as this story, this story, this story. I think I've seen some people who just stay obsessed over the details of this story for a very long time.
As I said to you earlier, the thing that really upsets me is the counting, is him not feeling he ever counts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if at the end he ever feels he counts.
And you wonder whether Flannery spent her whole life trying to believe that she counted to her mother.
Mm-hmm.
I can go down a really dark path on that train of thought. Thinking that Flannery spent her whole life trying to really believe that her mother loved her,
Mm-hmm.
accepted her, was proud of her, and it seems to me she might just really identify with all these sad children who are trying so hard to prove themselves to. Well, the storm's coming for us just any minute now. Thank you all. See you later. Well, declare victory. Move on. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.